Okay, this is Chapter 6, Section 4, beginning on page 174. The War is Won, American Diary. At the Battle of Yorktown, a Pennsylvania soldier named Ebenezer Denny saw a drummer boy on the British side beat a signal for a meeting. The cannon fire immediately stopped. From the British lines came an officer. Then an officer from the American side ran to meet him. Denny wrote in his journal, quote, "Firing ceased totally. I never heard a drum equal to it. The most delightful music to us all," close quote. From Record of Upland and Denny's Military Journal. Victory at Yorktown. Main idea. Washington's complicated battle plan led to the important American victory at Yorktown. History and you. How important is planning to the successful outcome of a project? Read to learn how Washington's planning helped the Americans win an important victory. Denny was proud to witness the steps leading to the British surrender at Yorktown. The building to this great event began a few months earlier. At that time, the Revolutionary War was at a critical point and both armies sought a victory. General Washington made plans to attack the British at Yorktown, Virginia, rather than in New York City. The Patriots hoped for help from the French. In July 1780, French warships appeared off Newport, Rhode Island. The ships carried the promised French aid soldiers commanded by Comte de Rochambeau. Unfortunately, the British fleet arrived soon afterward and trapped the French ships in Newport. In the autumn of 1780, Washington camped north of New York City. He waited for a second fleet of French ships. He also kept a close eye on the British army based in New York that General Clinton commanded. Washington planned to attack Clinton's army as soon as the second French fleet arrived. He had to wait a year to put this plan into action. The French fleet did not set sail for America until the summer of 1781. Change in plans. Washington followed the reports of the fighting in the South during 1780 and 1781. He knew that Cornwallis's troops were camped in Yorktown, Virginia, and that Lafayette was keeping them bottled up on the Yorktown Peninsula. He also learned that Admiral Francois de Grasse, the French naval commander, was heading toward Chesapeake Bay instead of New York. Washington quickly changed his plans. He would advance on the British at Yorktown rather than at New York City. Washington kept his new strategy or plan of action secret. He wanted Clinton to think the Patriots still planned to attack the British in New York. This, he hoped, would keep Clinton from sending aid to Cornwallis. Meanwhile, in July, Rochambeau had marched his troops from Newport to join Washington. Washington and Rochambeau then rushed south with their armies. The secrecy was so strict that most soldiers did not know where they were going. One soldier wrote, quote, "We do not know the object of our march and are in perfect ignorance whether we are going against New York or Virginia." Washington's troops marched 200 miles in 15 days. General Clinton in New York did not detect the forces heading south toward Virginia. Three groups, Lafayette's troops, Washington's and Rochambeau's American French army, and de Grasse's French fleet would meet at Yorktown. The Siege of Yorktown. Washington's plan worked perfectly. The British were thoroughly confused. By the end of September, 14,000 American and French troops had trapped Cornwallis's 8,000 British and Hessian troops at Yorktown. Meanwhile, de Grasse's fleet kept Cornwallis's from escaping by sea. General Clinton and the rest of the British army waited in New York. They were unable to help Cornwallis. Cornwallis's defeat. On October 9th, the American and French began a tremendous bombardment. One Hessian soldier wrote in his diary, quote, "One saw men lying everywhere whose heads, arms, and legs had been shot off." British supplies began running low. Many soldiers were wounded or sick. On October 14th, Washington's aide, Alexander Hamilton, led an attack that captured key British defenses. Cornwallis realized the hopelessness of the situation. On October 19th, he surrendered his troops. The Patriots had won the Battle of Yorktown. They took nearly 8,000 British prisoners and captured more than 200 guns. As the British marched between rows of French and American troops to hand over their weapons, a French band played Yankee Doodle. A British band responded with a children's tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." Indeed it had. Reading check. Explaining. Why did Washington advance in Yorktown? Independence. Main idea. The patriot spirit and resolve helped them win independence. History and you. What sort of influence do you think America's fight for independence had on the rest of the world? Read to find out how American ideals affected the world. The fighting did not end with Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown. The British still held Savannah, Charlestown, and New York. A few more clashes took place on land and sea. The victory at Yorktown, however, convinced the British that the war was too costly to pursue or continue. The two sides sent delegates to Paris to work out a treaty. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay represented the United States. The American Congress ratified or approved the preliminary treaty in April of 1783. The final Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. By that time, Britain had also made peace with France and Spain. The Treaty of Paris was a triumph for the Americans. Great Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation. The British promised to withdraw all their troops from American territory. They also agreed to give Americans the right to fish in the waters off the coast of Canada. The United States, in turn, agreed that British merchants could collect debts that Americans owed them. The treaty also stated that the Congress would advise the states to return to Loyalists the properties taken from them. The Newberg Conspiracy. Washington headquartered his strong army in Newburgh, New York, after the British surrendered. The Congress refused to fund the soldiers' pensions and failed to provide them with other pay. The soldiers' anger mounted. In disgust, some officers circulated a letter in March of 1783. If their demands were not met, the letter said, the army should use force against Congress. Washington realized that this threat of revolt was dangerous. The new nation could be destroyed. He persuaded the angry soldiers to be patient. Then Washington urged the Congress to meet their just demands. Washington's leadership ended the threat to the new nation. The Congress soon acted on the demands. Washington resigns. British troops left New York City in late November 1783. The war had truly ended. Washington could at least give up his command. On December 4th, Washington said farewell to his troops. 3 weeks later, he formally resigned at a meeting of the Second Continental Congress. Washington said, having now finished the work assigned to me, I retire and take my leave of all the employments of public life. Washington returned home to Mount Vernon, Virginia, in time for Christmas. There he planned to remain and live quietly with his family. Why the Americans won. How did the Americans manage to win the Revolutionary War? How did they defeat Britain, the world's greatest power? The Americans had several advantages in the war. First, they fought on their own land, while the British had to bring troops and supplies from thousands of miles away. The Siege of Yorktown showed how much the British depended on the sea. When their ships were blocked, the British troops had no support. Also, the Americans knew the local terrain and where to lay an ambush, a surprise attack. The British, in contrast, had much difficulty controlling the American countryside once they occupied the cities. Second, help from other nations contributed to the American victory. The French supplied soldiers, ships, and loans. The Spanish gave aid when they attacked the British in the Mississippi Valley and along the Gulf of Mexico. Perhaps the most important, the American Revolution was a people's movement. Its outcome depended not on any one battle or event, but on the determination and spirit of all patriots. As Washington remarked about the patriotic crowds, here is an army the British, will never conquer. Influence of the American Revolution. In 1776, the American colonists began a revolution. They made clear the principles of freedom and the rights outlined in the Declaration of Independence. These ideas bounded back across the Atlantic to influence the French Revolution. French rebels in 1789 fought in defense of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The French upheld these principles. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. By 1791, the ideals of the American and French revolutions traveled across the Caribbean and the Atlantic to the French colony of Saint Dominique. Inspired by talk of freedom, enslaved Africans took up arms, led by Toussaint Louverture. They shook off French rule. In 1804, Saint Dominique, present-day Haiti, became the second nation in the Americas to achieve independence from colonial rule. Quote, "We have asserted our rights," close quote, declared the revolutionaries. We swear never to yield them to any power on earth. Reading check. Explaining. Why did Washington take action to end the Newberg Conspiracy? And section 4, define the following: strategy, pursue, ratify, ambush. 2, summarizing what role did the French play in the Patriot victory at Yorktown. 3, why were the Americans successful in their fight for independence? And then 4, use a diagram like the one below to show what the United States and Great Britain agreed to in the Treaty of Paris. And the last question, number 6, the essential question: how did the Battle of Yorktown lead to American independence?